So yes, before I move to the core part of my talk, I just wanted to briefly introduce my practice and sort of trace how I ended up being so preoccupied with this topic of synthetic misinformation. So my background is in architecture, but I always found loopholes to do anything but architecture when I was studying architecture. I think this is a common story for many artists. So, I would make jewelry and furniture and make these sort of architectural sets that spoke to an emotional state rather than really having much of a practical application. But over time, I started to become more and more interested in sort of two tracks. So one of them was reconstructing and rewriting historical events. And the other one was documenting biases and lapses of scientific notations and sort of categorizing knowledge visually, as it were. So this is an example of my exploration into using 3D medium as a potential to rewrite our kind of patronage over nature, and that's from quite a few years ago. Currently, I'm working on two projects that relate to my residency at CERN. And these kind of, the interest there is really in the anomalies, the error, and the lapse. I try to look at the processes of this high intensity computation and point out where the vulnerabilities lie. This project, one of the projects, is going to become a long durational piece that is going to actually be housed in CERN's data center, where I will pick up on SEUs, so errors that tend to be automatically corrected that we don't really, in our computational experience, we're not really aware of. But in this case, I want to actually tap into them, harness them, and use them for a kind of a simulation. And this work references labor, human labor, of the so-called scanner girls, is an official term, who manually process the captures from particle collisions between 60s and 80s. It's also, in the project, I also reference layers of infrastructural devices at CERN and the sort of cross-generational collaborations. And the second project is kind of focused on the influence of cosmic weather on computational anomalies and error. So I look at the cosmic rays and the way that they historically have caused miscalculation of election results, for example, or caused near plane crashes. And I also revisit this very contested meeting between Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in 1941 during World War II, which actually in itself took place in the largest solar storm of the 20th century. But alongside this artistic practice that really pushes this idea of error and anomaly at its core, in this artistic practice, I think I really think often of the quote by Paul Virilio, where he talks about when you construct a shipwreck, when you construct the ship, you also create a shipwreck. And this sort of, there's a very strong interest in prodding the limit of the medium of capture and the understanding that the kind of studying and honoring the errors and the abnormalities becomes the true way of knowing the essence of the technology or of the medium of capture. But alongside this artistic practice, I have also been working for the last 8 years as a visual forensic investigator. So I worked with forensic architecture, but then also I became an investigator for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as kind of collaborated with many other smaller NGOs. And I mostly focused on documenting law enforcement violence and also investigation of suspected war crimes. So this is an example of work I did last year, which was looking into the drone warfare in Ukraine. But I also like to mention this project from quite a while ago. I think we did it at Forensic Architecture 2020. It was the investigation of a police killing of Mark Duggan. And I mentioned this project because I kind of understood very quickly that there's a lot we don't know in this investigation, and there's a lot we we will not know and cannot know. So instead of trying to work with the primary hypothesis, I decided to document all of the lapses and all of the gaps in our documentation. So for example, the diagram on the left, sorry, I'm like trying not to move too much because I can hear the microphone is picking up on everything. But the diagram on the left shows the tracking of figures in a very blurry CCTV footage. So each horizontal line is a figure. And you can see in the white strips how long we can see each figure in the footage, right? So it's like a kind of a documentation of the limit of visibility that the footage we had provided us. When you work on visual analysis and reconstruction, you will quickly realize that the process is rather iterative. There is no magic enhanced CSI style button, as you probably are aware of. But you often work without any metadata. You don't know where the image or footage that you were given comes from, what kind of camera took it. So then you have to really conduct an investigation with a series of questions. What do I choose to actually reconstruct? You can see that there's a massive gap between the detail present in the original footage and how I chose to reconstruct it, right? I have to question my own confirmation biases. I have to become extremely aware of the lapses of the original footage as well. So this process of reconstruction requires this really particular way of seeing. And I started to call it the distracted seeing of an investigative eye, meaning that you have to go against the kind of first cues or clues that the image is giving you, and you have to go often against it. You have to try to scan the image quite literally in the many different series of patterns and kind of a different choreography of seeing. And then something interesting started to happen in the last few years. You know, as much as I was already really questioning these biases in the process of reconstruction, I started to see that the forensic aesthetic, this sort of black and white render, it started to become almost hijacked by independent agents, either for propaganda or for profit. Like in this still taken from an advertisement for a so-called security parameter on the Polish-Belarusian border. And then, you know, in the investigative OSINT community, we were always quite aware of all of these attempts at hijacking the forensic aesthetic or creating synthetic evidence, as it were. And this is all pre-generative AI, like the stills from the war simulation game Arma 3. And then, of course, the kind of biggest question around the dependency of photographic realism as a carrier of visual truth came about in the early 2023. I think we can all relate to the feeling of awe mixed with fear and panic that kind of was present in the air at that time. And in the OSINT and investigative community, we really, it hit us quite hard. I mean, in some way, the biggest question at that time I remember was, what is our role now as investigators? Do we become verifiers of AI fakes? Is this going to be the kind of shift we'll have to manage? Is this kind of entire field kind of going to collapse itself? And ironically, it didn't help that in May of 2023, apart from like Balenciaga Pope images and AI Slope, the Norwegian branch of Amnesty International published this AI-generated image as a cover of one of their reports on the police violence in Colombia. And it was identified as AI. Later, there was actually like the tiniest watermark that, in the right-hand corner, so really easy to crop out. And then what I found really interesting is how Amnesty argued their choice. They said that it should have been obvious that this is an AI-generated image because of the high contrast of colors. That was one of the explanations. And then Elliot Higgins, the lead of Bellingcat, also released these images of the arrest of Donald Trump. So in response to this perceived flood of the kind of new potential kind of visual misinformation, we very quickly adopted the label of fake versus real, right? Kind of falling into the trap set up by Trump in politics. There is now two categories of images, fake or real, fake meaning AI generated, real meaning photographs. And the media really also, let's say, capitalized on this nomenclature and created these excellent portrayals of AI generative image reporting, these kind of red borders, massive stamps saying fake. My favorite one is digital danger. The sort of like real aesthetic of AI verification emerged at the time. And another thing that started to happen is we started to talk about photographic images as quote unquote raw data. So further sort of implying that photographs themselves are an accurate / objective representation of reality. And here's something important. You know, it's 3 years ago and the landscape is changing rapidly. And so part of my work is really trying to catalog the phenomena and catalog the lapses and artifacts that AI images of that era and subsequent eras bring about. So, you know, in that time we became kind of AI heromancers. We started to look at the hands of all of the humans we would see in photographs. I mean, that radically kind of already changes the way we engage with an image. That choreography that I mentioned starts to be directed by the hand, for example. I call these creatures polydactylites. And, you know, you might remember also from before that era, we would be told to look at ears, we would be told to look at eyes, and all of the other telltale signs. And it's quite an important mechanism there. It's sort of implying that there's still a way for us to perceive the real from fake, but it's also slightly implying that the better or the more high fidelity the AI tools are going to get, the more problematic and scary and impactful the problem of AI misinformation will be. One of the examples is studying Will Smith eating spaghetti, for which there is an official Wikipedia entry, right? So again, this is something developed to seemingly track the progress of generative models. So Will Smith eating spaghetti in 2023 it implies that we're quite far away from the AI doom disaster. But 2024, Will Smith eating spaghetti becomes quite scary. And for me, this became kind of an interesting phenomenon. I started to think about, in quite a stupid and naive way, but could there be a way in the future for us to prove our humanity by performing certain markers of reality, even if they might be extremely absurd, like eating spaghetti? Never mind. So yes, what I mentioned is that part of my work is really about tracking the evolution of both the technology behind generative AI, but more interestingly, also the way we talk about it. And alongside tracking how this kind of discourse is evolving, I'm also tracking policy changes when it comes to social media platforms. And there seems to be kind of hand-in-hand phenomenon where really catastrophic decisions have been made on X as soon as the AI slope images kind of captured our attention. But of course, the relationship to visual truth has always been a highly complicated and tense one. This is evidenced by the photo of battlefield in Belgium in World War I, which itself turned out to be a collage. So again, the problem of visual misinformation is just as old as photography itself, exposing just how problematic this concept of fake news is. Is kind of erasing the historical tension between photorealism and truth. And it kind of blocks an opportunity for necessary skepticism and criticism that we should cultivate with the emergence of AI images. So throughout my talk, you will understand, hopefully, that I'm not a kind of, I don't want to dismiss the AI image. I want to use it as an opportunity to further our discourse into how we aligned the idea of visual truth with photographic realism in the first place. So as the media utilized the AI panic, I kind of think that there is this uncanny feeling, right, that we have when we're being deceived by an AI image. And I kind of more and more believe that the feeling of deception we feel is not being deceived by the AI image itself, but being deceived by, again, our reliance on the photographic realism in the very first place, kind of realizing that perhaps we have fooled ourselves through this over-reliance. So to cut through the overwhelm and the sort of spectacle of the AI image, which is very hard to avoid. I mean, AI slope is fascinating, and for me, it's kind of mesmerizing also how the culture is evolving around it. But I decided to go against that kind of reverie and focus on selected images. And one of them became the Balenciaga Pope. And the reason for that was it is quite a low impact image. It didn't have massive consequence to like geopolitics or economy. It wasn't really consequential to anyone's personal life, as far as I know. And for me, there's something beautiful about how nonsensical that image is. And as you will see soon, how far it actually got me to understanding both technology behind the AI-generated images and also conceptually how rich it proved to be. I think that nonsense can be a wonderful carrier of truth and knowledge if you treat it very, very seriously. So to challenge my understanding of how uncanny the image is, I started to study it like a forensic object. I looked at all of the artifacts, or as I call them, blobsters, and the more I kept looking at the image, the more blobsters I was finding, especially when I gave myself this task of reconstructing the code physically. So again, this sort of task operationalized my vision, as I like to say, and made me see more and more inconsistencies in the image. The term blobster and blobification or blob squatch is something common in the project and became the beginning of this expanding vocabulary that describes these phenomena that emerge around the synthetic images, catalogs them in time, but also for me it became, in some cases, a way of countering the anthropocentric or anthropomorphic, rather, portrayal of AI technology, which I think is extremely misleading, right? So, for example, a blobster or blobsterization or blobification is a way of countering the term hallucination, right? Rather than saying that AI generative model hallucinates, I'd rather say it blobifies, because it indeed is a term that comes from kind of machine vision. It's about clustering of pixels, and it kind of describes the image for what it is without implying some sort of agency. So later on you will see, and if you see the work, you will see a lot of these terms come to life. Anyway, after finding these blobsters, I used 3D reconstruction at first just to kind of catalog it, because it was this familiar way of working for me, coming from forensic reconstruction. And then finally, I made the physical code. I also reconstructed the papal ring and cross and glasses. And I hired Derek to become my Pope. Here's a little trailer. So in the video, the Balenciaga Pope goes through a physicalized but visually really absurd process, which is meant to mirror the act of training an AI clone. For example, he watches a lot of footage of previous popes, he trains his voice, learns how to wave. Sometimes he's confused and uses the wrong input, resembling the known phenomenon of garbage in, garbage out, where using the low quality input results in low quality model output. The Balenciaga Pope delivers a monologue in the video, which directly quotes, among other philosophers, Walter Benjamin's text, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, from almost 90 years ago. Benjamin's concerns about photography are eerily similar to our concerns about generative AI. In the text, Benjamin also discusses his concern about photography's potential to distort reality. His concern also reiterates this mistake of us framing photography as a raw data, and it shows this sort of cultural evolution, how quickly we adapt to certain markers, visual markers, as representative of reality. The Pope, Walter Benjamin mentions how invisibility has been also, or can be used as a catalyst for faith, which really intrigues me, and I kind of really want to explore it further in my work, the sort of idea of counter-visuality or invisuality as a way of perhaps actually negotiating visual trust. In the later part of the film, the Pope goes into the city and he's confronted by the presence of others. This kind of further informs his behavior. And when I made the project, I was really adamant that everything has to be done absolutely physically. Everything in the film is a physical prop, and there's none to minimal digital processing. And in this scene, I came up quite organically with this idea of using physical, as I call them, attention notations. So these kind of usually graphical elements that negotiate evidentiary trust in the viewer. And this sort of way of making them physical denaturalizes them and kind of draws our attention back to this particular notation of trust. The blue hands appear in the film and they manipulate the Pope into specific positions and movements. They also dress him. And this sort of physicalizes the process of AI generation, but it also speaks to the relationship between trust and the role of the human hand in production of visual images. And I came across this really great text by Bruno Latour, the Modern Era of the Factish Gods? Gosh, Modern Cult of the Factish Gods. Yes, that's the name of the essay. I highly recommend it. And here he writes that if you show the hand at work in the human fabric of science, you are accused of sullying the sanctity of objectivity, of ruining its transcendence, of forbidding any claim to truth. The only way to defend science against the accusation of fabrication, to avoid the, quote, label of socially constructed, is apparently to insist that no human hand has ever touched the image it has produced. And he's talking there about the connection between religion and science, right? The way that religious icons, there's an insistence that actually the human hand was just channeling the kind of higher power. And I think there's another parallel to the generation of AI images, especially if you look at certain even artistic modes of production, where there is a certain way of offloading decision-making or a sense of objectivity to the model or to the process of AI generation. We also are mesmerized by these images, I feel, with a sense, with a sense of awe that's rooted in these kind of religious and scientific mechanisms of visual trust. So in this work, I'm really trying to disentangle the spectacle of technology with connotation of godliness. It's a bit ironic, but I feel like I'm quite irreverent to the figure of Pope for that specific reason. And the project was made 2 years ago, and ever since then we see this kind of rise of religious rhetoric around AI images and AI technology as such, starting even with Peter Thiel, who talks about people who are skeptics of AI as the Antichrist. What was really interesting is when I was making this project, Pope Francis was still alive, and he went to G7 summit, and delivered this very interesting speech about his idea of algorithmics. He mentioned that AI shouldn't have the ability to choose who to kill, only humans should be able to decide that. That was a really insane thing for me to hear. I mean, it's first of all, thou shalt not kill at all. So for me, it became like a way of manifesting this sense of securitization that AI has brought about, a way of modulating the benchmarks of morality or ethics because of this kind of higher, invisible yet looming threat that AI brings in so many domains of our life. It's worth mentioning that the Balenciaga Pope triggered a series of other popes, a Pope inception. One of them is really interesting, is a photo of the AI Pope Francis on a motorcycle, which about a year later became a real event in which Pope Leo, who, and I cannot state this enough, is living the life of the Balenciaga Pope, was photographed on a very, very eerily similar motorcycle. I started to wonder if this could have a name, this kind of phenomenon of the AI synthetic images modulating again the sort of limit of what is permissible or imaginable, and I'm toying with the term slope hyperstition. I also am thinking a lot about this idea of deep reality and challenge the conviction that visual reality is defined by its origin in physical or material reality. So for me, the Balenciaga Pope is quite honestly another kind of Pope in the sequence of papal representations, right? And if you look at the history of portraits of popes, they themselves become a way of marking some turns or evolutions in visual Western culture as such. There's also like a parallel to this idea of deep reality where the Balenciaga Pope image starts to respond to real life events. So when the Pope Francis died, rest in peace, there was an AI generated image of the empty coat. And this for me was really eerie because I've never seen the coat like empty like that apart from my work. And this idea of deep reality really started to kind of brew in my head, and I hired an actor and did this sort of series of experiments where the Pope became a way of kind of commenting on different phenomena around AI images and kind of visual culture as such. So yeah, for example, you see him eating spaghetti to prove that he's real. There's another thing that is happening that I started to term super abnormality. So again, the Pope is a great example of that. I get quite frequently images of Pope Leo doing something strange, apparently strange, even though it physically occurred, and friends asking me to verify it as if like I am a Pope expert. But I'm really fascinated by the way in which we are more and more suspicious of any kind of image and can almost develop this hallucination ourselves of seeing artifacts or perceiving the image as AI generated. I mean, Trump uses this in this method of like liar's dividend, where he claims any image that is not favorable for him is AI generated. But I think it's happening to us. It's changing the way that we are perceiving the limit of the uncanny, And so there's this term called supernormality, where in nature, certain animals prefer fake representations of, for example, their eggs to their actual eggs. And this sort of like favoring of the artifice over the biological. And I think the super abnormality captures the sort of reverse phenomenon where we like perceiving the photographic image as AI generated. And this brings me to the second visual case that I've been working on for more or less last year, which is the Pentagon explosion hoax. Does anyone recognize this image? It's a little bit more, I would say, niche somehow. It didn't make quite as big news as the Balenciaga Pope. It was published also in spring of 2023, and it spread really quickly throughout Twitter. It was reposted by crypto bros, by right-wing conspiracists, by Russia Today, but also it was reposted by few seemingly reputable-looking accounts like Bloomberg News. and 2 semi-reputable open source investigation accounts on X. And it only took 4 minutes for it to spread throughout the network and cause a financial crash. So it tanked the marker of stability of the market, S&P 500, but it also tanked a lot of crypto coins like Ethereum. And this was really interesting, right? Like after the 4 minutes, the market recovered. There was almost no sign for damage, kind of permanent damage in the market. If you ask anyone who engages in trading, it really didn't have that much impact. Only that few people who conducted this crash got really, really rich. But that's not really as interesting. What's really interesting is how terrible this image is. These are just few fragments I took from the image. There's so many artifacts. It's really, really poor quality AI. I mean, to some extent, it could also be just a really bad Photoshop, right? And while it claims to be an explosion at the Pentagon, I mean, this isn't the Pentagon. And again, what was really fascinating is how the media reported on it. The narrative repeated over and over claimed that if this image caused such a crash, then what will happen when we get to a higher AI image realism, higher fidelity? It repeats the same false equivalency that I discussed before, that the higher AI accuracy is being conflated with its own advancement and its impact. And what the reporting really seemed to miss is that it's not really due to the image that this financial crash happened, it's due to the network that permitted this kind of predatory financial hacking to exist. It was aided by progressive deregulation on X as a platform, and it was also allowed by high-frequency trading itself. So the way it would work, the way it works, is that an image published on X is becoming a way of corroborating a written claim. And so you have these algorithms that analyze posts semantically for any signs of kind of panic shifts in the market, right? And the signal gets propagated through like quantitative trading firms like Citadel. And then from that point on, it starts to send signals to more conventional like markers, to banks, and starts to affect all of the markers of the market stability. And this is also, in 2023, how I learned about Kalshi and like this potential of also event betting and event trading, and the sort of idea of this network creating not really just a deep fake, but really a deep financial reality. So it was a really complex idea and very complex research. So I decided to create a kind of a provocation and bundle it all under this fictional company called Deep Reality Markets, and created this promotional material for our products that enable you to do kind of a one-stop shop for financial image manipulation. And it combines those elements of the network and kind of avoids us focusing for just a second on the specific companies and the CEOs and the tech overlords, but really to think about how the kind of, again, reverie and spectacle of the synthetic image is hiding behind this whole series of mechanisms. In the promotional material, I reference my work and these other cases of visual misinformation, and I decided to make this product called Panic Image Generation Terminal, which kind of echoes the design of Bloomberg Terminal from the 80s. Highly recommend it, from like if you're into design, so nice. The fictional layer synthesizes all the otherwise invisible practices and systems, and I decided to kind of reconstruct this event of this hack crash, this 4-minute event, and created a fictional desk of a tech bro, or no, sorry, of a crypto bro, who I call him Kevin. He's kind of an amalgam of all of my research because the research was really, really opaque. It's really hard to kind of track the chain of command of who actually is behind this hack crash, this supposed hack crash. But the video displayed on these 6 screens is kind of a replaying of this event, but using Deep Reality Markets and our products as a kind of mechanism that really triggered it. And what was quite nice is I got to show it in Turin recently in the Chambers of Commerce. So in this beautiful Baroque palace, the Chamber of Commerce, kind of contrasting the conventional, still like somewhat material financial trading historically with this highly immaterial and speculative way of trading with these deep realities. And what I really wanted to show is that, as much as for quite a long time we have been told that the market is to some extent a measure of reality, right? The stability of the world and its sort of parameters would be reflected in the market. Now with this AI image provocation, we really see that the markets actually generate reality, right? Rather than reflecting it in this kind of very visceral and slightly stupid example that really, I hope, becomes apparent. So, looking back at this project and sort of still really mulling over these cases from 2023, it really made me realize that that particular era full of blobsters and these limitations is a particularly interesting example that we should keep revisiting and studying. It surprised me myself, right? The kind of investigation of these AI slop images became a way for me to understand the whole network and the sort of infrastructure that enables misinformation itself. So, yeah. I would leave it here, I think, and I will be open to questions and discussion.
I feel like all your, or at least all the pieces that you have shown, stay at the understanding, analyzing, and explaining the phenomena. But I feel like there's like a kernel of something there that maybe we could change reality by coordinating between like all of us and engaging in like a massive operation of fake image distribution. Have you ever considered that as a possibility or to do something?
I've talked to another artist for a while, kind of, what did we want to say? We wanted to call it like anti-venom. So creating like images that was almost, it was more around this idea that there is a belief that the synthetic images, they reinforce your short attention spans. There is kind of a whole technical process to that. It's part of my presentation tomorrow. So there's this idea that it reinforces your short attention span, and we had this idea of creating kinds of images that do the opposite, that almost untrain this tendency to look very punctually at images, that encourage this more cohesive and this distracted seeing within an image. So that was one of the ideas, is could we create this kind of anti-venom project, which we never got around to, but like, it would be just wonderful to develop a strategy that is creative and generative rather than just a way of commenting, right? Like, I think that's a moment where we are, as artists, a little bit stuck after this first kind of, like I said, like the spectacle of the AI image and the kind of need to comment on it and process it and digest it. I think now we're entering a space where we need to find ways of having some more agency or kind of generative agency ourselves. I mean, there's kind of like a Dada turn or like a Dada movement that results from it, which in a way is leading somewhere interesting. And maybe that is a way of creating like an alternative reality, visual reality or alternative event. But then it's also hard to do that when this absurdity is also happening within systems that have conventionally been used as sort of like serious markers of political stability or economy, right? Like we now see, to talk again about these betting markets, that people are genuinely performing certain activities in order to change reality. I mean, I don't know, again, like, I saw a meme yesterday that someone went to a weather station and affected the like wind direction seemingly to change. Whether it's true or not is within the realm of possibility. I also wanted to mention, this idea that someone eating spaghetti could be a way of verifying their identity is actually not that far from true, because do you remember like a month and a half ago, Netanyahu was showing 5 fingers to a camera, like claiming that he himself is real. So maybe it's also a way of capitalizing on these absurd moments and turning them again into something we can claim and we can own. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how kind of a parody or satire used to be the main tool of the artist to comment on this sort of technological entanglement, and now it's almost been usurped by the far-right aesthetics, and sort of the question is now, what do we do? And I don't have an answer, but I think like your question for me like triggers all of these things I'm sitting with and thinking about a lot these days, but I haven't found my way out of it yet. But I don't really want, for my work specifically, I don't want to comment anymore. I also want to find a way to collectively like generate something. So hopefully maybe the workshop is a way for us to come up with some strategies. I don't know.
I was also thinking of these images of Nicolás Maduro being captured, where the AI images are not creating reality, they are creating reality, but not a completely new reality, but reinforcing something that already happened. So in a way, it's propaganda, but also activates the narrative towards like a public. But maybe we could try to deactivate those same images through generation.
Totally. I mean, a similar thing happened with this Pentagon image. There's this concept of like affective indexicality. So certain like indexes, certain visual elements triggering almost historic signals and kind of reactivating them because of kind of how some of our emotional responses are rooted in specific historical like priors. So, yeah. There's something there, no? Like with manipulating those like iconic representations. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really not a thorough answer.
Okay, I think I'm going to speak in Spanish. Maybe you can translate. Solo como por hacerme una idea. I come from architecture also. Y mi pregunta trata sobre. I'm gonna switch a little bit because I don't have it like really clear the question. So, a mí me interesa mucho el render y la imagen renderizada, ¿no? En arquitectura. Y entiendo, more or less, y entiendo el render como esta piel, ¿no? Que recubre. The skin. And when I saw the project of the code, you only had an image. As in forensic architecture, you also work with images, right?
Yeah.
You always see only the skin, the outside, and you have somehow to work also this inside part, like the invisible part.
Yeah.
How do you do it? Like this for me is the most interesting part, or the creative part, or somehow like where you, I don't know, I don't want to say like inventar.
No, but you do. Because like, I mean, there is several things that happen. Like one of them is when you reconstruct something from an image, first of all, you will work with like a 3D modeling software. You will fall into this like bias that everything in the world is rectangular. Let's start there. That things attach perfectly and that they're perpendicular to each other. Well, they don't, right? So if you take sometimes these sort of assumptions about reality as a given, you might end up making the wrong measurement or the wrong reconstruction. So the biggest like anxiety within this process is, or should at least be, that there's so much you don't know and there's so much unknown. And when you reconstruct the model, it will never be almost never, unless you are able to go to the site and do a survey, right? It will almost never be an accurate and precise representation of reality. However, it's still a really good representation of reality because it's referential to each other. Like if you build enough points of reference within the model that you're in control of, it will still be like a cohesive operational device. And then the question of materiality comes about a lot, and I think more and more, sometimes materiality itself starts to have like register in the medium, right? Like it can mess with it can produce itself artifacts, it can produce like weird signatures in the image, and the more you work on cases like that, the more you start to notice these sort of like, again, anomalies and errors and aberration. And for me, this is, again, it's important to prod anything that looks inconsistent or a bit odd. And kind of like track it. But indeed, like, there's always like a connection to the surface. It's always like a little bit building upon layers of biases and layers of limitation. But as long as everything is in reference to each other in the surface world, then it is a kind of a forensically sound model, if that makes sense. But I'd love to talk about it more because I have some like really cool obsessions and some examples that I can show you that I think about a lot. And like I couldn't explain to you how many times I would have to make a decision and like interpret something one way or another and would just agonize over it, and kind of with time, because it's an iterative process, like forensic reconstruction is, you just gain like a weird confidence where you just kind of, you feel more in control of it. But the first years I was just like nobody cares that something's 3 centimeters away, you know, if you're talking about like a scale of a city or like a massive explosion, but you still like agonize, like, what if, you know?
Thank you.
I'm going to speak in English. This isn't really a question, just more of, this reminded me something, and I want to know if you looked at this or you think anything about it. But your discussion of the Pope really reminded me, especially because it also has to do with fashion, of the photos of Lauren Sanchez, the wife of Jeff Bezos, at her wedding in Venice, where there were major abnormalities seen in her wedding photographs of her dress, which was like this is probably one of the most expensive wedding in the world or something. And it's like, why did they choose to use AI photos like on the cover of Vogue to show the world? Like, what is the point when you have the most money in the world of using an AI photo of a major international spectacle? Like, what are you trying to show the public with this fake image? Did you look into this at all?
I didn't know about it, but like I know Lauren Sanchez, and like I think there's like a really interesting conversation about taste and style, right? Because like you see the big comment. I know there's this whole discourse around her fashion and how close she is with Vogue, right? And then people are noticing that whatever she wears, it always looks kind of cheap, quote unquote, even if she wears like very designer clothes. And I think it shows to this shift also with like perfected and curated image starting to appear rather cheap and sort of flattened, and then this pursuit of like imperfection and this sort of like slopcore in fashion that is emerging, and sort of like trying to curate almost like this sense of authenticity through like a curated error or like a curated imperfection. And maybe there's something, I need to look into that. That's really interesting, because also people were pointing to me examples from like Renaissance painting and studies of Renaissance paintings being used in fashion courses, where these almost impossible garments are then being studied by students and reconstructed physically, like the drapery and all of these kind of details. So maybe there's something interesting in this triangulation of like, Lauren Sanchez and these Renaissance paintings, and the idea of like impossible fashion and curated perfection. I don't know, but I haven't seen those. I need to have a look. Anyone? And also with the 3D modeling, just wanted to add, what also came to my mind is that when you create a 3D model, you always have one hypothesis, but it might not stand the test of a counter hypothesis, because your hypothesis itself might have like already preconditioned the choices you make, what you reconstruct and which level of detail, what level of kind of precision, like which scale you work in, like do you work down to the millimeter, or do you just leave it at the meter, right? So it might not stand the scrutiny of someone else's, but it doesn't mean that it's the wrong representation. It just means that it's not that it's been, in a way, to some level limited by the hypothesis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.